It's wonderful to have a chat to Jeff Brayley, social researcher at station sponsor McCrindle. They bring data to life, and you do that for leaders in business, in organisations, churches, community groups. Jeff, what is the data that leaders should be looking at as they look into the future?
Leaders should be using multifactorial data. It's all about variety and lots of different data sets. We want to help leaders become really powerful at impacting and shaping a positive future. And so futuristic thinking is what we want to encourage people towards. You also need to be thinking generationally, understanding how society is changing, and also be practical, not just theoretical. Leaders should have a vision for the future and a plan for today.
Now, generations are working side by side so much more. Do you have any data around that?
Absolutely. A whole report, and there's a great infographic on the generations at work right now. 4 generations in Australia, from Gen Zs aged 16 to 30, who are motivated and looking for accessible and approachable leadership, all the way up to baby boomers that are looking for proximity when looking for new work. They want something close to home. And so we've got a great infographic there available for leaders to engage and motivate their teams effectively.
Jeff, I've seen this treasure trove. It really is. You're giving full access for 7 days. So how can people actually get access to this?
You can get the 50 plus infographics, 40 plus reports, courses, all on mccrindle.com. Search McCrindle Plus and you'll find that 7-day free trial. And we hope it empowers a positive future for all of society.
Jeff, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.
Station sponsor McCrindle, and you can get all that at mccrindle.com. If you love words, maybe you host a podcast like this. Some people, we just love words. My mates are always saying, Clayton, you'll use 20 words when 10 would actually do. I love telling stories. I love being a part of what that is. But words have such impact, don't they? And that they actually craft not only the way we communicate, but the way we interact, and in fact, even parts of the way culture works. And today we're going to be hearing some stories of those people from hundreds of years ago who are impacting the way you and I operate right now. We're going to hear that with the author of The Dictionary People. Sarah Ogilvie is joining me today. Just before we start this conversation with Sarah, would you like, rate, review, give 5 stars, share it with friends, follow this podcast. It's all for free, but we just love getting it out to more and more people. Let's get chatting with Sarah Ogilvie. G'day, Sarah.
Hi, Clayton. It's great to be with you.
It is so good to have a chat to you. And before we even specifically talk about this book, I need to sort of dig into your love of words and language, because you have been involved in this sort of area for a long, long time. Take us back to when you first discovered language. I know my mum was always a child who literally went home every day in primary school and got out her dictionary and learnt a new word and then wrote it out. She was just fascinated by words. Was that your sort of experience growing up, or was the love of words coming a bit later?
She sounds wonderful.
Yes.
Well, your mum sounds absolutely wonderful. I actually came to words from the left field, really. I started out as a mathematician and a computer scientist and then simply I didn't know about linguistics and the science of language until after my first degree. And then I read this book purely by chance called Language by Edward Sapir. And it was written in 1921. And he had gone around North America living with different indigenous communities and learning their language, and wrote this book that when I just by chance read it as an undergrad studying maths, it blew my mind, because for the first time reading that book, I realized that it's through language that we can access a culture. And it's through language that we can access someone's view of the world. And that just captivated me. So I studied linguistics and then thankfully became an editor on the Oxford English Dictionary. And now I teach at Oxford. So that's how I came to the whole world of words and language.
And also in there, I believe you were actually the chief editor on an Australian edition of the Oxford Dictionary. Is that true as well?
Yes, I was. And in fact, I started studying linguistics at the Australian National University, and it's there that the Oxford Dictionary is based, at the Australian National Dictionary Centre. So while I was a grad student, I got a part-time job there and actually did the pronunciations for the first Oxford Dictionary to have Australian pronunciations rather than British ones. And then I worked for the Macquarie Dictionary for several years before coming over and working at the mothership of the Oxford English Dictionary here in Oxford. So dictionaries and lexicography have played a very special part in my life. And I love them. And I love meeting people who love dictionaries. So your mum, I would love to meet.
Yes, yeah.
She sounds terrific.
Could we take a bit of a step back? Because you talked about this idea of the fact that by understanding words, understanding language, we can sort of understand people. Do you think there's also sort of the reverse happening with that as we, say, compile a dictionary, for the first people that ever did that, or as you were about doing, working with that and continually working on that actually by putting words together, by compiling them, that can actually influence back the culture and the way people do that? Do you think that's a true thing, or am I maybe stretching the impact of it too much?
No, well, I think that it definitely was like that at previous times. So there are previous periods of history when dictionaries really played a powerful role in standardizing the language. So I think for about 4 centuries there, dictionaries played that role. That, I think, began to change in the 20th century. And of course, people were saying probably about 15 years ago, oh, dictionaries are dead and we don't need dictionaries now thanks to technology. But what they didn't realize is that actually dictionaries are powering the back end of the internet, that dictionaries were providing this structured data for a lot of the digital tools and methods that are now used. So, when we're using text to speech or speech to text, when we're using autocorrect on our phones, that is all powered originally from dictionaries. So actually, dictionaries now are incredibly vital to technology and to a lot of the features which we use without even realizing today.
And I think that it is that sort of aspect. I mean, there's a good sense to that, that as things are there and they now become just the baseline of what it is, that's a good thing that we've got those. But I think what your book is doing as well, The Dictionary People, is actually about, let's talk about the remarkable thing that it means to be able to take them for granted, as it were now. I know one of the sort of the lines around this was that, the history of the first great sort of crowdsourcing experiment in the Victorian age, which is actually this idea of putting the Oxford English Dictionary together. Now, you've talked about your love of that, but to go and tell a history of it, was there just this deep, abiding passion to tell the story? Was there something more that you were hoping to achieve from the book? And then I'd love to hear some of the stories.
Yeah, so when I was working as an editor on the Oxford English Dictionary, so there's a bit of a difference between the Oxford Dictionary, the smaller desktop dictionary, which most of us probably have on our desks, or certainly use like the Pocket Oxford or the Concise Oxford, which we used when we were school kids. That's quite different from what the Oxford English Dictionary is. So the Oxford English Dictionary is the largest dictionary in the world. It was started in 1858, and when they first thought of the dictionary, they thought, let's do something really radical. Let's produce a dictionary with every word in the English language in it. And when we exemplify each of those words, let's take example sentences from how people are actually using the language. So rather than Samuel Johnson, who was quite prescriptive in 1755, Samuel Johnson's dictionary told people how they should be using words, what words definitely meant, and that was quite a prescriptive text. But 100 years later, in 1858, when a small group of men gathered in London and came up with this idea of putting together the Oxford English Dictionary, they wanted it to be different. Rather than prescriptive, they wanted it to be a descriptive dictionary that actually described how people used words and how they wrote them. But to gather all of the material for that, they needed to find examples from written books. And they knew that a small group of men living in London or in Oxford couldn't do such a massive task by themselves. So they came up with this brilliant idea of crowdsourcing, and they asked people all around the world, so not just within Britain, but they sent leaflets and they put in ads in newspapers down in Australia, in New Zealand, South Africa, Canada, the States, everywhere, and said, could you please read your local books and write out examples of your words from those books and send them to us. Write them out on little 4x6-inch slips of paper and send them to us. And they really took a risk with that. They had no idea whether people would actually do it, but people did. And so many people sent in these slips of paper to James Murray, who lived here in Oxford. So many people sent in slips that the Royal Mail had to put a red pillar box outside James Murray's house, which is still there today at 78 Banbury Road. And so when I used to work as an editor on the dictionary, all of those slips were kept and they were stored down in the basement. And I used to sometimes, I'd be revising one of James Murray, he was the longest serving editor, some of his entries from the 19th century. And I'd wonder, I wonder why James Murray chose to do that or chose that particular quotation. So I'd walk down into the basement and find the box with those actual slips and check them. And throughout time, we've thought that there were several hundred people who sent in slips. But I would look around me down in that basement, and there were hundreds of boxes. And in fact, there are 2 million slips still stored down there. And I'd look at all of those boxes and think, there had to be more than a few hundred people. But we couldn't find proof or actual evidence of who those people were until a decade ago, Clayton, when I was down in that basement and I was looking through some of the boxes, and purely by chance, I took the lid of this dusty box and there was this little black book inside, tied with a cream ribbon. I took off the cream ribbon and opened it and immediately recognized James Murray's immaculate handwriting. This was his address book with all the names and addresses of all those people around the world, and not just their names and addresses, but he had written down every book that each person had read, the number of slips that they had sent in, the date that he received them. And so I just looked at this thinking, this finally tells us who all those people were. And when you think about it, these were the unsung heroes. These are the people that without them, the dictionary could never have been written. And so I then found 2 more address books. So I found 3 address books belonging to James Murray down in that basement. And then the following summer, in the Bodleian Library, I found 3 address books belonging to James Murray's predecessor. So with these 6 address books, I spent the next 8 years of my life researching and finding out as much as I could about each of those people. So it turns out that there were actually 3,000 people, and they're very colourful characters. And so yes, that's what's in the dictionary, people, and that's how I came to write it. Sorry, that's such a long answer.
No, it was I was just reveling in the story and the joy that I would imagine when you sort of first discovered that, and like, and then the sort of the realization of what it's going to mean more and more. And wow, your dedication to 8 years of study. I imagine, Sarah, we are aiming to hear a number of those stories. We're obviously not going to be able to hear all of them. That's why you've written the book, The Dictionary People. But but we would like to hear a couple of them. But before we get to that, just sort of the idea of going on a journey. I'm assuming when you started, you didn't realize it would be 8 years, but I reckon it must be fascinating to almost sort of go back and uncover stories. Was there learnings you took about how to perhaps either do that more quickly, or perhaps maybe that wasn't the aim, it was to do it more, substantially, to understand somebody? With just this process itself, I suppose I'm fascinated by that before I even hear the stories. What did you learn yourself about understanding stories from these slips and these notes?
Yes, well, I learned such a lot. The number one thing that I learned is that very few of these people were famous and were the sort of established scholars. So they were very hard to find because they didn't have records. They they hadn't written books. No one else had written about them. So what I had to do, and thankfully I at the time of writing the book, I was teaching at Stanford in the States, and Stanford loved this project and were very generous in supporting my research, and my students loved it as well. So a group of students collaborated with me, and together because these people were relatively unknown, or at least completely unknown, but luckily, because in the address book we had their addresses, so we could look up the censuses and old death certificates, marriage certificates, and so we did all of this kind of painstaking research of going through and just trying to trace people. And to do that task, since there were so many people, I actually created 2 databases and used technology to help me store and record as much as I could about each of the people. And basically, I think it was just my personal curiosity. And the more that I discovered, like for example, in 1861, the British census decided to put in an extra column in their census for people who, what they called as blind, deaf, dumb, or lunatics was the language used. And so several of my people had lunatic written beside them in that column. And it so happens that those 4 people with lunatic beside them were actually the 4 highest contributors. It was someone who had sent in, so these people were so dedicated that the top contributor sent in 165,000 slips.
Whoa.
The next top contributor sent in 156,000. And so that then told me that those people were considered at that time lunatic. They were probably just like me. They were on the spectrum, and doing this kind of detailed, repetitive work suited them. And so that's how they found themselves living in psychiatric hospitals. But that's just a little example of the kind of thread that I would then follow. So then I would look up their address and find the institution that they were in. I would then go to that institution's archive and look up the doctor's reports of when they came into the hospitals, the kind of symptoms that they were displaying. So they're the kinds of threads that I followed to find out as much as I could about the dictionary people.
Just wonderful. We're going to be back with Sarah Ogilvie in just a moment, the author of The Dictionary People, and we're going to start hearing about some of the people and their stories. And boy, there's some phenomenal stories that you do not want to miss. Some remarkable people and some remarkable experiences that they were going through when they sent these in. So that's on the way in just a moment here on Towards Understanding.
Share your brand, your event, your message across 90 Christian radio stations and major cities in Australia and New Zealand by sponsoring Towards Understanding, hosted by Clayton Bielen. More than 210,000 people tune into Towards Understanding each week, and with just one sponsorship, you'll reach this immense engaged audience. Find out more about this exciting and unique opportunity now on the sponsorship page at positivemedia.com.au.
Now, Sarah has done a whole host of things in her life. She has originally studied computer science, mathematics. We haven't even talked about the fact that you were part of helping develop the Kindle, again, based on words, Sarah. We are really focusing on the fact that been involved with both the Oxford English Dictionary, an Australian form of that with the Oxford Dictionary in Australia, and now teaching at the University of Oxford, involved and loves the work of dictionaries, has gone back and looked through the original dictionary that was sort of crowdsourced from around the world, whole lots of slips of paper How many total slips of paper did you say was sent in from around the world?
2 million.
2
2
million.
million slips were sent in.
Just
yeah,
incredible.
and they weren't sent in just from people within the empire either. They were sent in from people. There were people from Japan and South America and parts of Africa. This was truly a global project. And in fact, there were 200 people from Australia and many people from New Zealand. So many, in fact, that there is a whole chapter on N for New Zealanders, and a lot about a group of men in Melbourne at the University of Melbourne and at Melbourne Grammar School who sent in hundreds and in fact thousands of Australian words. And in fact, one man called Edward Ellis Morris, he sent in so many Australian and New Zealand words that James Murray, who was the longest-serving editor over in Oxford, wrote back to him and said, you should actually write your own dictionary using all of this wonderful material. And so he did. He wrote the first dictionary of what's called Australasian English in 1898. So that's Edward Morris's dictionary of Australasian English, which is a really wonderful dictionary, but it's not known enough. And so if any of your listeners can find a secondhand copy, it's a really terrific dictionary, which gives such a snapshot of life in 19th century New Zealand and Australia through those words, just as you were saying before, that it's through the words that we can get a snapshot of someone's culture.
Yeah, love that. And so it was these 2 million that sort of created this first Oxford English dictionary. I'm just mindful too that, you sort of said all of these different places around the world. I'm assuming the focus was to be English-based words in these cultures and languages. Were people sending words from other languages in and then sort of had to be sort of pushed aside to put other things, or was it mostly understood that that's what it was?
No, it's a fantastic question. So in fact, people were sending in words from Maori, from Aboriginal Australian languages as well, but they were always words which were used in an English context. And so Murray was very strict about putting in a word. He said, as long as a word is used in an English context, so meaning that word is surrounded by all other English words within that sentence, that word then has a rightful place in the English dictionary. And so he put in hundreds of Indigenous words from around the world, and he was criticized for it. So when they started the dictionary in 1858, they thought it would take 2 years to write. Then they thought it would take 10 years to write. It actually ended up taking 70 years to write. And rather than wait, so they started in 1858, rather than wait until 1928 when it was finally finished, but rather than wait till then to sort of publish it all in one go, which they did in 12 volumes ultimately, but rather than wait for that, they thought, and plus they needed to make money along the way because it's a very expensive project, they published it gradually. And so in actually 126 little fascicles, little chunks of the alphabet. And as each of those chunks of the alphabet were published, they were reviewed, and people would say, and those reviews were really scathing of Murray putting in all of these words that they considered foreign, that they considered there were people saying these outlandish words had no place in an English dictionary. But Murray was really enlightened and so forward-thinking, and so he just kept on putting in all of these so-called foreign words. So if you go to that first edition of the Oxford English Dictionary, it's remarkably global and incredibly inclusive in its coverage of what was considered English.
Now let's talk a bit about some of the people. As you said, you went and you discovered this, and then you spent 8 years uncovering those people who are actually a part of writing these stories. Talk to us about some of the more fascinating people and their stories that you've uncovered.
Oh, absolutely. So, I really struggled with the structure of the book because I wanted to make sure that I sort of drew out the most captivating characters while also telling the story of the creation of the dictionary, and from the bottom up rather than a kind of top down history. And so I tried all different structures, and then finally during the night, one night, it just came to me, why don't I structure it in the same way that Murray may have structured it, alphabetically? So it's 26 very short chapters, so it's A to Z, and I've written it in such a way that I could just picture the reader just reading a quick chapter before going to sleep at night. And so the first one is A for archaeologists, but I could have started for A for Americans, because I discovered that there were 15% of all these people were from America. So there were hundreds of Americans sending in words as well. But I started it with this woman called Margaret Murray, who lived in Calcutta in India. And as a teenager, she started reading for the dictionary and sending in these slips. And she would wake up every morning and take a book from her mother's shelf and go up to the roof of their house in Calcutta before the sun started beaming and before the weather got too hot. And she'd sit up on the roof copying out words from her mother's books, which were mainly travelers' tales from India. In fact, they were two things. They were words from the Bible. So she spent 4 years sending in words from a particular translation of the Bible, and then the rest of the time she read her mother's travelers' tales and sent in hundreds of words from Indian English, and that's how so many words got in from India. But some of my favorite characters, so there is C for cannibal. There is a man who, in fact, was an explorer of the Northwest Passage and took part in these two quite doomed voyages to try and discover the Northwest Passage in the Arctic. And one of them, this was known as the Franklin Expedition, in which there were 21 men and 11 of them perished. And this man ended up eating some of his fellow travelers, and he comes back to Britain and spent his final years writing out slips for the dictionary and sending in Scottish words from Scottish ballads. There were many families, so there were lots of families who would gather together at night around the gas lamp, reading books together and writing out slips and sending them in. And so in Murray's address book, he would list each member of the family, the daughters, the sons, the mum and the dad, with every book that each person read. So that gives us a beautiful glimpse of what family life in the 19th century was like. There were actually hopeless contributors as well. So in Murray's address book, he's written beside like all these little notes like useless or hopeless or someone stole the book, things like that. So that's fun. And one of those hopeless contributors was actually Karl Marx's daughter, Eleanor. She just went, well, first of all, she insisted on being paid, and normally no one was being paid for this. That's another thing about the dictionary people. They did this for free. They were absolutely devoted and dedicated to creating the dictionary. They did all of this work for free, but Eleanor Marx refused to do that for free. So first of all, she made Murray pay her, and then all that she did was she just went into the British Library, took an existing glossary off the shelf and just wrote out slips from this existing dictionary, which was then, of course, useless for Murray, and Murray was furious. But there's, there are so many colourful characters. Another really fun one is P for pornographer. So there was a man who actually sent in all the sex words. So there are lots of sex words in the first edition of the dictionary, which no one really realised before this book. But let me think of other fun people. I don't know whether you sort of had some favourites, but there were lots of women. That's another discovery, that this is a time when women, of course, didn't have equal access to education, and yet there were so many intelligent women wanting to use their brains and wanting to contribute to the dictionary. So there are nearly 500 women sending in slips and contributing and helping create the dictionary.
Yeah. And I think that goes back to what you were talking about a bit earlier on as well, wasn't it? That this idea that it's much more inclusive than perhaps its time would normally be around that, whether it's including a lot more words from around the world that are a bit more indigenous to certain parts but are used in the English language, or women contributors in that same way from that period. It's quite a wonderful moment of, again, we talk about language helping shape the future, that this is an important part of what that is.
It so is, and that I think was one of the big revelations of the book was what a democratic dictionary this was. Democratic in the words that it included, but also democratic in the people who contributed to it and helped create it. Because, as I said, these weren't the professionals, these weren't the famous scholars, these were the amateurs, the autodidacts. Most of these people left school early at 14, just like James Murray himself. So the famous chief editor, the longest serving editor, he left school actually at 14. And as I tell his story through the book, he's really, part of the main narrative structure of the book, because he comes as an outsider to Oxford, and in fact is never really accepted within the scholarly world within Oxford. He is always on the fringes, and I think it's thanks to his knowing of his outsider status that he's able to correspond to all of these people, and he can sympathize and empathize with them and strike up really profound friendships and relationships with them. I mean, I found that there were several contributors who leave their will to him, and thanks to that, he is able to continue his dictionary work, because Oxford University Press paid him very, very little for this, and he was a terrible businessman, and he agreed to write the dictionary for £10,000, thinking that it would just take him 10 years. Well, it took him 36 years, and unfortunately Murray actually dies before the dictionary is finished. And so he was always struggling for money, because out of that kitty of funds he had to pay some assistance, he had to pay for all the postage, all the ink, all the paper, all the books. So that was a bad financial deal for Paul Murray, but it's thanks to the dictionary people. Many of them came to the financial rescue as well. So again, it's not just their actual labours, but it's their money too that helped this be a successful project.
Well, I think it's absolutely fascinating how you've covered off those people. You've covered off, I believe, telling the stories and understanding people who were, either in jail for murder or whatever else it might be. The various aspects.
There were 3 murderers.
Right. Yes,
that's right. I forgot to mention them.
And how did you work that out? I'm assuming they're not writing down, by the way, I'm a murderer, here's my latest words to add in.
Well, one of the murderers actually we did know about, because he ended up in Broadmoor lunatic asylum, which is what it was called then, and he actually had murdered someone. So, and there's a wonderful book about that by Simon Winchester. And so we knew about him, but what we didn't know, is about that there were 2 other murderers. So one of them was that man who I called a cannibal before. He actually murders an indigenous man on that journey to the Arctic. And then there was another murderer, Maya Bridge, who in fact is a famous photographer from that period. And I tell the story where his wife was having an affair with someone, and Maya Bridge tracks down the lover and shoots him dead at point blank. And it's thanks to the founder of Stanford University, Leland Stanford, that he gets off going to prison. So basically, as I'm following all of these clues and threads, for someone like Maya Bridge, I went through the 19th century newspapers, and in fact, there are books written about Maya Bridge as well, telling the story of the murder. But I, of course, also went to the 19th century newspapers and read the actual newspaper reports about the different court case and things such as that. So, yeah.
Just remarkable. I love your passion for the stories. I love that it influences all of us as we use English, as we speak it, we write it, we share it as well. Sarah, thank you for just taking a bit of time for us. I suppose my final question to you as we do wrap up is that, the English dictionary, the Oxford English Dictionary, keeps being different editions, so sort of words keep being added. Maybe some are sort of indicated, well, they're not being used anymore. But what's the best way forward for us as you think about words? You're spending your time with that. What would you challenge each of us to say, hey, how would we think about our words and our language better going forward? Is there things that you've always thought, well, if I could just sort of wave a magic wand and make everyone think about it like this, I reckon that'd be better for us in our language. What would that be?
Well, we are living at such an exciting time for language. I mean, I think a lot of people are thinking, oh no, it's terrible now with social media and with the internet and with texting and what is going to happen to the language. But lexicographers are actually really excited now because for the first time in history, we can actually track the life of words. Most of the new words, of course, start as slang, and they start in the fringe marginal communities, which in the past took decades to then filter through to the standard general readership or to the general speaker. But now, of course, thanks to Twitter, thanks to Instagram, thanks to TikTok, these marginal groups are getting huge audiences. And so words that are coming in, especially, say, from African American English or from different sub communities, they are now accessible and we can watch them spread at such a speed. And so words that are coming into the language now are traceable. And so it's a really exciting time. So I think just to have an openness to that and for us to be listening to our children and to our grandchildren and learning from Gen Z, because most of their language will filter up to us. And so, yes, I just encourage everyone to be as open as possible, especially to the new words that are coming in from different subcultures.
Sarah, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for the opportunity to just have a chat about this and your love of these stories and these words as well. It is we can hear the passion in it. Thank you so much for your time.
I've been delighted to talk to you. Thank you, Clayton, and I love the show. All the best. Bye-bye.
Sarah Ogilvie, the author of the book The Dictionary People, here on Towards Understanding. It's wonderful to have a chat to Jeff Brayley, social researcher at station sponsor McCrindle. They bring data to life, and you do that for leaders in business, in organisations, churches, community groups. Jeff, what is the data that leaders should be looking at as they look into the future?
Leaders should be using multifactorial data. It's all about variety and lots of different data sets. We want to help leaders become really powerful at impacting and shaping a positive future. And so futuristic thinking is what we want to encourage people towards. You also need to be thinking generationally, understanding how society is changing, and also be practical, not just theoretical. Leaders should have a vision for the future and a plan for today.
Now, generations are working side by side so much more. Do you have any data around that?
Absolutely. A whole report, and there's a great infographic on the generations at work right now. 4 generations in Australia from Gen Zs aged 16 to 30 who are motivated and looking for accessible and approachable leadership, all the way up to baby boomers that are looking for proximity when looking for new work. They want something close to home. And so we've got a great infographic there available for leaders to engage and motivate their teams effectively.
Jeff, I've seen this treasure trove. It really is. You're giving full access for 7 days. So how can people actually get access to this?
You can get the 50 plus infographics, 40 plus reports, courses, all on McCrindle.com. Search McCrindle Plus and you'll find that 7-day free trial. And we hope it empowers a positive future for all of society.
Jeff, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.
Station sponsor McCrindle, and you can get all that at McCrindle.com.